The rain hammered against Eleanor's small cottage like angry fists. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and stirred the watery soup in her iron pot. The wind howled through the cracks in her wooden walls, making the single candle flicker and dance. It was October 1547, and the autumn storms had been terrible this year. For 3 days straight, the rain hadn't stopped. The muddy road outside her cottage had turned into a river of thick brown water. No travelers had passed by in days, which meant no coins in Eleanor's purse. She was 28 years old, but the hard life of a peasant woman had already put lines around her green eyes. Her husband William had died of fever the winter before, leaving her alone in their tiny cottage. She survived by selling eggs from her 6 chickens and herbs from her small garden to people traveling the main road. But with this storm, even her chickens stayed huddled in their coop. The herbs in her garden were drowning under the endless rain. Eleanor counted the few copper coins in her wooden bowl. There were only enough for another week, maybe 2 if she ate less. She ladled the thin soup into her only bowl. It was mostly water with a few vegetables from her garden. There wasn't much, but it was warm, and warmth was precious on a night like this. Thunder crashed overhead so loud it shook the small cottage. Eleanor jumped, spilling a bit of soup on her rough wooden table. She had lived in this cottage her whole life, but storms like this still frightened her. That's when she heard it. Above the howling wind and pounding rain, someone was beating on her door. Not knocking politely, but hammering with desperate fists. Eleanor froze. Who would be out in weather like this? The nearest village was 3 miles away. Bandits sometimes used storms to hide their movements. William had always warned her about opening the door to strangers at night. The pounding came again, harder this time. Then a man's voice, barely audible over the storm. "Please, I beg you, help me." Eleanor's heart raced. The voice sounded educated, not like the rough speech of bandits. But then again, clever thieves could put on false voices. She crept closer to the door, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor. "Who are you?" she called out. "What do you want?" "My name is Thomas," the voice replied. "I'm a merchant. Bandits attacked me on the road. They took everything. Please, I'm soaked to the bone. I fear I'll die of cold if you don't help me." Eleanor pressed her ear to the wooden door. The man sounded truly desperate. His voice shook, whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. Through a crack in the door, she could see a dark figure hunched against the rain. She thought of William's words, spoken many times during their 5 years of marriage. "The good Lord watches how we treat strangers. Ellie, a cup of water given to someone in need is worth more than gold." Eleanor took a deep breath and lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured her door. The wind immediately tried to tear the door from her hands as she opened it. The man who stumbled inside was nothing like she expected. He was tall, with dark hair plastered to his head by the rain. His clothes were fine quality, but torn and covered in mud. She could see they had once been expensive. The fabric was good wool, not the rough cloth common people wore. But what struck her most were his hands. As he reached out to steady himself against her wall, she saw his fingers were smooth and white. These weren't the rough, calloused hands of a merchant who loaded wagons and counted coins all day. These were the hands of someone who had never done hard work. "Thank you," he gasped, water dripping from his clothes onto her floor. "Thank you so much. I thought I would die out there." Eleanor quickly shut the door against the storm and looked at her unexpected guest. He was shivering violently, his lips blue with cold. Whatever secrets he might be hiding, he clearly needed help right now. "You're freezing," she said. "Come by the fire." She led him to her small fireplace where a few pieces of wood burned weakly. It wasn't much warmth, but it was all she had. Thomas, if that was really his name, knelt by the flames and held out his hands. "I must look terrible," he said, trying to smile. "The bandits caught me completely by surprise. Took my horse, my money, everything." Eleanor studied his face in the firelight. He was perhaps 30 years old, with kind eyes and a strong jaw. Despite the mud and exhaustion, there was something noble about the way he carried himself. He sat straight even while shivering, and his voice had the careful pronunciation of someone educated. "Where were you traveling to?" Eleanor asked, bringing him a rough cloth to dry his face. "London," Thomas replied quickly. "I have business there. Important business that cannot wait." Eleanor noticed how he paused before saying business, as if he wasn't used to using the word. But merchants talked about business all the time. Strange. The road to London is dangerous even in good weather, she said, especially for someone traveling alone. I wasn't alone, Thomas said, accepting the cloth gratefully. I had guards with me. But when the bandits attacked, everything happened so fast. In the confusion, I became separated from my men. I've been walking for hours trying to find shelter. Eleanor nodded, though something about his story didn't quite fit together. If he was a merchant with guards, he must be wealthy. But wealthy merchants usually traveled in groups with other traders for safety. And they certainly didn't travel during storm season. But these questions could wait. Right now, the man needed help. You need dry clothes, she said. I still have some of my husband's things. She went to the old wooden chest where she kept William's belongings. It pained her to open it. She hadn't touched these clothes since his death. But William would have wanted her to help someone in need. She pulled out a rough brown tunic and simple pants. They would be too small for Thomas, who was taller than William had been, but they were dry and warm. Your husband? Thomas asked gently when she handed him the clothes. He died last winter, Eleanor said simply. Fever took him. I'm sorry for your loss, Thomas said, and the sympathy in his voice sounded genuine. It must be difficult living alone. Eleanor just nodded. It was difficult, but she had learned not to dwell on sadness. Sadness didn't put food on the table or fix a leaking roof. You can change behind that curtain, she said, pointing to a corner of the room where an old piece of cloth hung from the ceiling to give privacy. While Thomas changed clothes, Eleanor looked at his muddy garments. The fabric was definitely expensive. Fine wool dyed a deep blue that only wealthy people could afford. The stitching was perfect, the kind of work done by the best tailors in London. If this man was a merchant, he was a very successful one. Thomas emerged wearing William's clothes. They were indeed too small, ending well above his wrists and ankles, but he didn't complain. In fact, he seemed almost amused by the simple peasant clothing. Much better, he said. Thank you for your kindness. Eleanor hung his wet clothes near the fire to dry. As she did, she noticed something that made her pause. Sewn into the collar of his fine tunic was a small symbol, a crown embroidered in gold thread so tiny she almost missed it. It was the kind of detail that marked clothing made for the royal court. Her heart skipped a beat. Who was this man, really? But before she could think too much about it, Thomas swayed on his feet. The warmth of the fire was making him realize how exhausted he was. You need food, Eleanor said, pushing aside her suspicions, and rest. She served him her soup, giving him the larger portion even though it meant she would go hungry. Thomas ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if he had never tasted anything so good. This is delicious, he said. What herbs did you use? Eleanor was surprised. Most people, especially men, never asked about cooking. Just thyme and a bit of sage from my garden, and some wild onions I found. You know much about herbs, Thomas observed. Have you studied them? Eleanor almost laughed. Studied? I can't even read. I learned from my mother, and she learned from hers. When you're poor, you learn to use what the earth provides. Thomas looked at her with something that might have been respect. That's a kind of knowledge you can't get from books. There was something in the way he said books that told Eleanor he had read many of them. Another piece that didn't fit with his merchant story. After they ate, Eleanor realized she faced a problem. She had only one bed, a simple straw mattress in the corner of the room. Where would Thomas sleep? You take the bed, she said. I'll sleep by the fire. Absolutely not, Thomas replied firmly. You've already shown me incredible kindness. I won't take your bed as well. They argued about it quietly for several minutes, both too polite to be truly angry. Finally, Eleanor spread her only blanket on the floor by the fire and made Thomas take the bed. As she lay on the hard floor, listening to the storm rage outside, Eleanor wondered about the mysterious man sleeping in her cottage. His hands were too soft for a merchant, his clothes too fine, his speech too educated, and that tiny crown sewn into his collar. But whatever his secrets, he had been desperate and cold, and she had helped him. That was what mattered. William would have been proud of her. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the little cottage, two strangers found warmth and safety together. Eleanor had no idea that she had just sheltered the most important person in all of England. The young man sleeping in her bed was no merchant named Thomas. He was Edward, King of England, fleeing from enemies who wanted to control him or worse. Eleanor woke to the sound of rain still drumming on her roof. The storm had not stopped during the night. She sat up slowly, her back aching from sleeping on the hard floor. The fire had burned down to glowing coals and the cottage felt cold and damp. She looked toward her bed and saw that Thomas was still sleeping. In the gray morning light coming through her small window, he looked younger somehow. His face was peaceful, without the worry lines she had noticed the night before. Quietly, Eleanor added wood to the fire and went outside to check on her chickens. The rain soaked through her shawl immediately, but she needed to make sure her birds were safe. They were her only source of income. When she returned, Thomas was awake and sitting on the edge of the bed. He looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry I slept so long," he said. "And I'm sorry you had to sleep on the floor. That was wrong of me." "You needed the rest," Eleanor replied, shaking water from her shawl. "How do you feel?" "Much better, thanks to your care." Thomas stood up and looked around the cottage. "The storm is still terrible. I don't think I can travel today." Eleanor nodded. The truth was she was glad for the company. The cottage felt less lonely with another person in it. But she worried about having enough food for 2 people. "I'll need to find something for us to eat," she said. "I don't have much." Thomas's face reddened. "I have no money to give you. The bandits took everything. I feel terrible being a burden." "You're not a burden," Eleanor said firmly. "We'll manage." She went to check her small store of food. There were a few vegetables left from her garden, some dried herbs, and a small piece of cheese she had been saving. It wasn't much, but she could make it stretch. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked at him doubtfully. In his borrowed peasant clothes, he looked like he was playing dress-up. But she needed wood chopped for the fire, and her supply was running low. "Can you use an axe?" she asked. Thomas straightened up. "Of course. I'm sure I can manage." Eleanor handed him William's old axe and showed him the pile of wood behind the cottage. She watched from the window as Thomas approached the chopping block. He lifted the axe awkwardly, clearly unsure how to hold it properly. His first swing missed the wood completely and nearly threw him off balance. His second swing hit the wood but barely made a dent. Eleanor covered her mouth to hide a smile. This man had definitely never chopped wood before. After watching him struggle for several minutes, Eleanor went outside. The rain was lighter now, just a steady drizzle. "Here, let me show you," she said gently. She took the axe and demonstrated the proper grip and stance. "You have to let the weight of the axe do the work. Don't fight it." Thomas watched carefully and tried again. This time he actually split the wood, though it took him 3 swings to do what Eleanor could do in 1. "You make it look easy," he said, breathing hard from the effort. "I've been doing it since I was 12, Eleanor replied. "After my father died, my mother and I had to learn to do everything ourselves." They worked together for an hour, Thomas struggling with the axe while Eleanor stacked the wood. She noticed how he kept stopping to examine his hands, which were getting blisters from the unfamiliar work. "You really have never done this before, have you?" Eleanor asked. Thomas paused, the axe in his hands. For a moment she thought he might tell her the truth, but then he forced a smile. "I usually hire men to do this kind of work," he said. "I spend most of my time with account books and negotiations." It was a reasonable answer, but Eleanor noticed how carefully he chose his words. Everything about this man suggested he was used to having servants do physical work for him. That was very unusual for a merchant. Back inside the cottage, Eleanor prepared their simple meal while Thomas sat by the fire, examining his blistered hands. She found herself stealing glances at him. Despite his claims of being a merchant, he ate with perfect manners the way nobles did at grand feasts. He held his spoon correctly and chewed quietly. "Tell me about your trade," Eleanor said as they ate. "What do you sell?" Thomas hesitated just a moment too long. "Various goods," he said finally. "Cloth, spices, things people need." "That must take you far from home," Eleanor said. "Do you have family?" A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "I have responsibilities, people who depend on me. That's why I must reach London as soon as possible." Again, Eleanor noticed how he avoided giving direct answers. Most merchants loved to talk about their families and their successful trades. Thomas spoke like someone carrying a heavy burden. "What about you?" Thomas asked, changing the subject. "Have you always lived here?" "All my life," Eleanor said. "I was born in this cottage. My parents worked this same land. When I married William, we took over from them." "You never wanted to see other places? London, perhaps?" Eleanor laughed. "London? That's a world away from here. People like me don't go to London." Thomas looked at her curiously. Why not? You're intelligent, resourceful. You could make a life anywhere. With what money? Eleanor asked. I can barely afford to keep this cottage. Besides, I wouldn't know how to live in a city. This is my world. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes I think simple lives are the happiest ones, he said softly. There was such sadness in his voice that Eleanor felt her heart stir with sympathy. Whatever this man's real story was, he was clearly troubled by something. That afternoon, the rain finally stopped, though gray clouds still covered the sky. Thomas offered to help Eleanor with her garden, where the storm had damaged many of her plants. Watching him try to garden was almost amusing. He had no idea which plants were weeds and which were vegetables. He pulled up carrots thinking they were unwanted growth and carefully watered a patch of weeds. I'm hopeless at this, aren't I? He said, laughing at himself. You're learning, Eleanor said kindly. Everyone has different skills. As they worked together, Thomas began asking her questions about the plants. He seemed genuinely fascinated by her knowledge of which herbs could heal headaches, which ones helped with fever, and which could be used to preserve food. How do you know all this? He asked. My grandmother was a healer, Eleanor explained. She taught my mother, who taught me. When you can't afford doctors, you learn to heal yourself. Thomas listened to every word as if he were a student and she were the teacher. Eleanor had never had anyone pay such careful attention to her knowledge before. Most people took her healing skills for granted. In London, Thomas said thoughtfully, physicians charge gold coins for knowledge like yours. Maybe, Eleanor said. But their patients probably get better just as slowly as mine do. Thomas laughed, and Eleanor realized it was the first time she had heard him truly laugh. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less burdened. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas began to tell stories. He spoke of far-off lands with spices that smelled like flowers and silk so fine it felt like water. He described great libraries full of books and churches with windows made of colored glass that painted rainbows on the floor. Eleanor listened with wonder. She had never imagined such places existed. You've traveled very far for a merchant, she said. Knowledge is a kind of travel, Thomas replied carefully. You can visit distant places through books and conversations with other travelers. Eleanor nodded, though she still sensed he was hiding something. But the stories were beautiful, and she found herself not caring if they were entirely true. When it came time to sleep, they argued again about who should take the bed. This time Thomas won by pointing out that Eleanor had worked harder than he had and deserved the comfortable rest. As Eleanor lay in her own bed for the first time in 2 nights, she listened to Thomas settling down by the fire. She heard him moving restlessly and then a soft sound that might have been crying. Thomas? She whispered. Are you all right? There was a long pause. I'm fine, just thinking about home. Eleanor wanted to ask more, but something in his voice told her not to press. Whatever pain this man carried, it was deep and private. The second day passed much like the first. Thomas tried to help with chores and failed cheerfully at most of them. But Eleanor found she enjoyed teaching him, and he seemed to find peace in the simple work. On the 3rd day, Thomas woke with a fever. Eleanor found him shivering by the cold fire, his face flushed and hot. I'm all right, he insisted when she felt his forehead, just a little tired. But Eleanor could see he was truly sick. The cold and exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Back to bed, she ordered. I'll make you something for the fever. Thomas was too weak to argue. Eleanor tucked him into bed and went to prepare her strongest fever remedy, willow bark tea mixed with elderflower and honey from her one remaining honeycomb. For the rest of the day, she tended him as she would have tended William. She bathed his face with cool water, made him drink the bitter tea, and sat by his bedside even when he seemed to be sleeping. In his fever, Thomas spoke strange words. He muttered about crowns and betrayal, about enemies at the gates and faithful friends. Once he cried out, I won't let them destroy England, so loudly that Eleanor feared he might have lost his mind. But she stayed with him, cooling his fever and making sure he drank water. Whatever secrets he carried, he was just a sick man who needed care. By evening, his fever broke. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Eleanor with confusion. How long was I sick? He asked weakly. Eleanor woke on the 4th morning to sunlight streaming through her small window. For the first time in days, the sky was clear and blue. She could hear birds singing outside, and the road had finally stopped being a river of mud. Thomas was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking out the window. His fever was completely gone and color had returned to his cheeks. But there was something different about him this morning, a tension in his shoulders and a distant look in his eyes. "Good morning," Eleanor said softly. "How do you feel?" "Much better," Thomas replied, though he didn't smile. "The road will be passable today." Eleanor's heart sank, though she tried not to show it. She had known this moment would come, but she wasn't ready for it. "You don't have to leave immediately," she said. "You could rest another day." Thomas shook his head. "I've already stayed too long. People will be looking for me. If I don't reach London soon." He stopped himself from saying more. Eleanor busied herself preparing breakfast, trying to hide her disappointment. She had grown used to having someone to talk to, someone to cook for. The cottage would feel terribly empty when he left. As they ate their simple meal of porridge and the last of her dried apples, Thomas seemed lost in thought. He kept looking around the cottage as if trying to memorize every detail. "You've been very kind to me," he said suddenly. "Kinder than I deserved." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied. "You were in need. Anyone would have done the same." Thomas gave her a sad smile. "No, Eleanor. Not everyone would have opened their door to a stranger in a storm. Not everyone would have shared their last food with someone they didn't know. Not everyone would have sat up all night caring for a sick man who might have been lying about who he was." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "Were you lying about who you were?" For a long moment, Thomas didn't answer. He stared into his bowl as if the porridge might give him the right words. "I told you my name was Thomas," he said finally. "That much was true. Thomas is my middle name. But I haven't been entirely honest about other things." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What things?" "I'm not exactly a merchant," Thomas admitted. "I do have business in London, but it's not the kind of business I let you believe." Eleanor waited for him to explain further, but he seemed to struggle with how much to reveal. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" she asked gently. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You could say that. The kind of trouble that follows a man wherever he goes." Eleanor felt a chill of fear. "Are you a criminal? Are you running from the law?" "No," Thomas said quickly. "Nothing like that. I've done nothing wrong, at least not in the way you mean. But there are people who want to control me, who would use me for their own purposes. That's why I was traveling in disguise." Eleanor's mind raced. Who would want to control a merchant? Unless he wasn't a merchant at all. "Who are you, really?" she whispered. Thomas looked at her for a long time, and she could see him making a difficult decision. "I can't tell you," he said finally. "It would be dangerous for you to know. The less you know about me, the safer you'll be." Eleanor felt hurt and confused. After 3 days of caring for him, of sharing her food and her home, he still didn't trust her with the truth. "I understand," she said, though she didn't really. After breakfast, Thomas went to collect his clothes, which had finally dried by the fire. Eleanor watched as he changed back into his fine garments. The expensive blue wool and perfect stitching looked strange to her now, after seeing him in William's simple clothes. When he emerged fully dressed, he looked like a different person. The peasant clothing had made him seem approachable and ordinary. Now he looked every inch the nobleman she had suspected him to be. "I need to ask a favor," Thomas said. "If anyone comes asking about me, anyone at all, you must tell them you never saw me. Can you do that?" Eleanor nodded, though the request frightened her. What kind of enemies was this man running from? "And if anyone threatens you because of me," Thomas continued, "or if you ever find yourself in serious trouble, I want you to have this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold ring. Eleanor gasped when she saw it. The ring was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, set with a large red stone and covered in intricate engravings. "I can't take that," Eleanor said, backing away. "It must be worth a fortune." "It is valuable," Thomas admitted, "but not as valuable as what you've given me." "I only gave you soup and a place to sleep," Eleanor protested. Thomas shook his head. "You gave me something I had forgotten existed. You showed me what it feels like to be treated as just another person, not as what I am. For 3 days I wasn't carrying the weight of my responsibilities. I was just Thomas learning to chop wood badly and getting blisters on my hands." Eleanor saw tears in his eyes and her heart ached for him. Whatever burden he carried, it was heavier than anything she could imagine. "You must take the ring," Thomas insisted. pressing it into her hands. Listen to me carefully. If you ever find yourself in desperate need, if you're starving or in danger, take this ring to London. Go to Westminster Palace and show it to the guards at the main gate. Eleanor stared at him in shock. Westminster Palace? But that's where the king lives, yes, Thomas said simply. Show them the ring and tell them that Thomas sent you. Tell them about the storm and how you helped a stranger. They'll know what to do. Eleanor turned the ring over in her hands. The engravings were incredibly detailed. She could see a crown, a lion, and symbols she didn't recognize. The red stone caught the light and seemed to glow like fire. What if they don't believe me? Eleanor asked. What if they think I stole it? They'll believe you, Thomas said with certainty. That ring, it's unique. There's no other like it in all of England. When they see it, they'll know you're telling the truth. Eleanor wanted to ask more questions, but something in Thomas's manner told her this was all he could say. She wrapped the ring carefully in a piece of cloth and hid it in her wooden chest, beneath William's clothes. When she turned back, Thomas was standing by the door. He looked like he was gathering courage for something difficult. Before I go, he said, I want you to know something. These 3 days with you have been the happiest I've had in years. You've reminded me what goodness looks like. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. You're being too kind. I'm being honest. Thomas walked over to where she stood and took her rough, work-worn hands in his smooth ones. Eleanor was surprised by how gently he held them. Then, to her complete shock, Thomas lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them softly, the way she had seen lords do to great ladies in the village festivals. You have shown me what true nobility looks like, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It has nothing to do with titles or wealth. It comes from here. He touched his hand over his heart. Eleanor stood frozen, not understanding why he was treating her like a lady when she was just a poor peasant woman. I will never forget your kindness, Thomas continued. And if God willing, someday I may be able to repay it properly. Eleanor found her voice. You owe me nothing. You would have done the same for me. Thomas smiled sadly. I hope I would have. I truly hope I would have. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. Eleanor, he said without turning around. Promise me something. Promise me you'll think well of me, whatever you might hear about my life in the future. Of course I will, Eleanor said, confused by the strange request. Thomas opened the door and stepped outside. Eleanor followed him, squinting in the bright morning sunlight. The world looked clean and fresh after the storm, with puddles reflecting the blue sky. Which way will you go? Eleanor asked. South, toward London, Thomas replied. I should reach the main road by midday. Eleanor wanted to say so many things. She wanted to ask his real name, to understand why he seemed so afraid, to know if she would ever see him again, but the word stuck in her throat. Be safe, she managed to say. Thomas turned back one last time. Thank you, Eleanor. For everything. Then he walked away, following the muddy path that led to the main road. Eleanor watched until he disappeared around a bend in the lane. Even then, she stood in her doorway for a long time, staring at the empty path. The cottage felt impossibly quiet when she finally went back inside. Eleanor sat at her wooden table and looked around at the space that had felt so alive just minutes before. Now it was just her small, dim cottage again, with her few possessions and her simple life. She went to her chest and pulled out the ring, unwrapping it carefully. In the morning light, it was even more beautiful than she had first thought. The red stone seemed to hold fire inside it, and the gold was so pure it gleamed like the sun. Eleanor had no idea that she held the personal seal of the King of England. She didn't know that the mysterious Thomas was actually Edward VI, the young king who had inherited the throne when he was only 9 years old. She couldn't have imagined that for 3 days. The most powerful person in England had chopped her wood, eaten her simple food, and slept in her bed. All she knew was that a kind, troubled man had brought magic into her life for 3 days, and now he was gone. She wrapped the ring back up and hid it away, thinking she would probably never have reason to use it. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the clear sky. Eleanor fed her chickens, tended her garden, and began the ordinary work of her ordinary life. Eleanor's legs nearly gave out as Captain Henley led her through the magnificent corridors of Westminster Palace. The walls were covered with tapestries that cost more than her entire village was worth. Paintings of stern-faced nobles looked down at her, and golden decorations glittered everywhere she looked. Her muddy shoes left marks on the polished marble floors, and she was painfully aware of how out of place she must look in her ragged dress. Servants in fine livery stared at her as she passed, whispering to each other about the strange peasant woman being escorted through the royal palace. Captain Henley noticed her distress. "Don't mind them," he said kindly. "They've never seen anything like this before." "Like what?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone returning a dead king's personal seal with a story that sounds impossible," the captain replied. "If you're telling the truth about King Edward, you may be the last person who saw him happy." They climbed a grand staircase that seemed to go on forever. Eleanor's weak legs struggled with each step, and Captain Henley had to slow his pace for her. Finally, they reached a set of enormous wooden doors carved with the royal coat of arms. "Her Majesty Queen Mary is in her private chambers," Captain Henley explained. "She'll want to hear your story herself." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. "The Queen? But I can't meet the Queen. I'm nobody." "You're someone who may have the answer to a 7-year-old mystery," Captain Henley said gently. King Edward disappeared for several days in October of 1547. When he returned, he was different, calmer, more thoughtful. He spoke of meeting someone who had shown him great kindness, but he never said who or where. After that, he kept asking his advisors about the lives of common people in ways he never had before. The enormous doors opened, and Eleanor found herself in a room that was larger than her entire cottage. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating furniture that looked like it belonged in a cathedral, and there, sitting in a chair that was almost a throne, was Queen Mary herself. Eleanor had heard stories about Queen Mary. Some called her Bloody Mary for the harsh punishment she gave to those who opposed her. Eleanor expected to see a terrifying woman with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. Instead, she saw a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and graying hair. Queen Mary looked sad and worn down, as if carrying the crown was a burden that grew heavier each day. "Your Majesty," Captain Henley said, bowing deeply, "this is the woman with King Edward's ring." Eleanor tried to curtsy the way she had seen village women do when nobles visited, but she was so nervous she nearly fell over. Queen Mary watched her with curious eyes. "Show me this ring," the Queen commanded, though her voice was gentler than Eleanor had expected. With trembling hands, Eleanor unwrapped the ring and held it out. Queen Mary took it and examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands. "This is indeed my brother's personal seal," Queen Mary said softly. "I watched him wear it every day for 6 years. How did you come to have it?" Eleanor took a shaky breath and began her story. She told Queen Mary about the terrible storm in October 1547, about the man who called himself Thomas appearing at her door, about the 3 days they had spent together. She described how he had struggled with simple tasks, but spoke like an educated nobleman, how he had been kind and grateful despite clearly being used to a life of luxury. As Eleanor spoke, Queen Mary's expression changed from suspicion to amazement to something that might have been joy. "He really lived as a common person for 3 days?" Queen Mary asked. "Yes, Your Majesty," Eleanor replied. "He chopped wood badly, tried to help in my garden, and got blisters on his hands. He seemed fascinated by my herb knowledge and listened to my stories about village life as if he had never heard such things before." Queen Mary was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Edward was 9 years old when he became king," she said. "From that day forward, he was surrounded by advisors, tutors, and courtiers. He lived in palaces and wore fine clothes and ate elaborate meals, but he was never allowed to simply be a person." Eleanor began to understand. "He seemed so interested in ordinary things. The way I cooked, how I knew which herbs to use for healing, why I chose to help a stranger. After he returned from those missing days, he was different," Queen Mary continued. "He asked questions about his subjects that he had never asked before. He wanted to know how ordinary people lived, what they needed, what made them happy. His advisors thought he was going through a phase, but I knew something important had happened to him." Queen Mary stood up and walked to one of the tall windows, still holding the ring. "Edward died 3 years ago," she said sadly. "He was only 15 years old. But before he died, he left very specific instructions about a debt he owed." Eleanor felt confused. "A debt, Your Majesty?" Queen Mary turned back to her. "He said that somewhere in England was a woman who had shown him the greatest kindness of his life. He described her as having green eyes and gentle hands, and said she lived in a cottage near a road where travelers passed. He said she had saved his life during a storm, not just from the weather but from forgetting what goodness looked like. Tears came to Eleanor's eyes as she recognized her own description. Edward left instructions that if this woman ever came to the palace with his personal ring, she was to be rewarded for her kindness, Queen Mary continued. He set aside money and land for her and made me promise to honor his wish. Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. But, Your Majesty, I only did what anyone would do. I gave him soup and a warm place to sleep. Queen Mary smiled for the first time since Eleanor had entered the room. You gave the King of England something no one else had ever given him. The chance to be treated as an ordinary person deserving of kindness, simply because he was human. You saw him as Thomas the Merchant, not Edward the King, and you cared for him anyway. Captain Henley stepped forward with a scroll of parchment. Your Majesty, shall I read King Edward's instructions? Queen Mary nodded. Captain Henley unrolled the scroll and began to read in a formal voice. By order of His late Majesty King Edward VI. If a woman with green eyes should come to Westminster Palace bearing my personal seal, and if she should tell a story of sheltering a man named Thomas during a storm in October of the year 1547, then she is the one who showed me mercy when I needed it most. To this woman I leave a cottage on royal lands near the village of Henley, with enough land for a good garden and a small income for life. I also leave my gratitude, which is worth more than gold, for she reminded me that kings are only men, and the best men are those who show kindness to strangers. Eleanor stared at Captain Henley, unable to process what she had just heard. A cottage, land, an income for life? I don't understand, she whispered. Why would he do this for me? Queen Mary came over and took Eleanor's hands, just as Thomas, King Edward, had done 7 years ago. Because you saved more than his life that night, Queen Mary explained. You saved his soul. Edward told me that those 3 days in your cottage were the only time in his life when he felt truly at peace. You treated him like he mattered not because he was powerful, but because he was a person in need. Eleanor thought about the young man who had struggled to chop wood, who had listened to her herb knowledge with such interest, who had been fascinated by her simple life. She remembered how he had kissed her hands like she was a lady, and how he had seemed so sad when he left. He was just a boy. Eleanor said softly, underneath all that responsibility he was just a lonely boy. Yes, Queen Mary agreed, and you were the only person who ever saw that. Over the next few hours, Eleanor was taken to meet with royal clerks who explained her inheritance. The cottage near Henley was larger than her old home, with fertile land and a small stream running through it. The income Edward had left her was modest, but enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. You'll never have to worry about taxes or hunger again, one of the clerks explained kindly. Eleanor was also given new clothes befitting her changed status, and a hot meal that was the best food she had eaten in years. But through all of this, she kept thinking about the mysterious young man who had shared her simple soup and slept in her bed. That evening, Queen Mary invited Eleanor to dine with her privately. As they sat in the Queen's smaller, more comfortable chambers, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been troubling her. Your Majesty, why was King Edward traveling alone during that storm? Why was he in disguise? Queen Mary's face grew serious. There were people at court who wanted to control him, to use him for their own purposes. Edward was young, but he was intelligent enough to know he was being manipulated. That October, he escaped from the palace to meet with advisors he trusted, men who could help him take real control of his reign. So he was in real danger? Yes, Queen Mary said simply. If his enemies had found him during those 3 days, they might have killed him or imprisoned him. Your cottage was the safest place in all of England for him, because it was the one place where no one would think to look for a king. Eleanor thought about this. Without knowing it, she had protected the King of England during one of the most dangerous moments of his life. He spoke about you often after that, Queen Mary continued. He said you had taught him what true nobility looked like. 7 years passed like water flowing down a hillside, sometimes rushing, sometimes slow, but always moving toward an unknown destination. Eleanor's life grew harder with each passing season. The first winter after Thomas left was brutal. Snow piled high against her cottage, and ice made it impossible to travel to the village market. 3 of her chickens died from the cold, leaving her with only 3 birds to provide eggs. She survived by eating thin soup made from dried herbs and the few vegetables she had managed to preserve from her garden. By spring, Eleanor was thinner than she had ever been. Her clothes hung loose on her frame and her face had grown gaunt. But she was alive, and that was something. The second year brought different troubles. A sickness swept through the region, killing crops and animals alike. Eleanor's garden produced only half its usual harvest. Many of her neighbors suffered even worse. Some families abandoned their cottages and headed to the cities hoping to find work. Eleanor thought about leaving too. But this cottage held all her memories of William and her parents. She couldn't bear to abandon the only home she had ever known. The third year was the year of the great rains. Water fell from the sky for weeks without stopping, turning the ground into a swamp. Eleanor's garden flooded, destroying her vegetables. Worse, the roof of her cottage began to leak badly. She spent miserable nights lying awake with water dripping onto her face, unable to afford the materials needed for repairs. By the fourth year, Eleanor was forced to sell her remaining chickens one by one. First, she sold 2 birds to pay for repairs to her roof, then another when she ran out of food during a particularly harsh winter month. Finally, she was left with just 1 hen, a tough old bird she called Peasant. The 5th year brought a new hardship: increased taxes. The local tax collector, a stern man named Master Crawford, arrived at Eleanor's door demanding coins she simply didn't have. "The crown needs money for its wars," Master Crawford explained without sympathy. "Every landowner must pay their share." "I barely own anything," Eleanor protested. "This cottage and a small garden. That's all I have." "Land is land," Crawford replied coldly. "You owe 3 silver pieces by year's end." 3 silver pieces might as well have been 3 golden crowns to Eleanor. She had perhaps 6 copper coins to her name. The 6th year was when Eleanor truly began to starve. Her garden, weakened by years of poor harvests, produced almost nothing. Her last chicken, old Patience, finally died of old age. Eleanor survived by gathering wild berries and roots from the forest, and by trading her healing herbs to anyone who would give her a scrap of bread in return. She grew so thin that her neighbors began to whisper that she was wasting away. Some offered help, but they had little to spare themselves. These were hard times for everyone. It was during this 6th year that Eleanor first thought about the ring Thomas had given her. She would take it out sometimes at night when hunger kept her awake, and wonder if his strange instructions had been real. Westminster Palace seemed like something from a fairy tale, impossible to reach for someone like her. The 7th year arrived with the cruelest blow yet. Master Crawford returned with 2 soldiers and a final demand. "You still owe 3 silver pieces in taxes," he announced, "plus interest for the delay. The total is now 5 silver pieces." Eleanor's heart sank. "Please, Master Crawford, I have nothing. I've already sold everything I own." "Then you'll lose the cottage," Crawford said without emotion. "The Crown will seize it to cover your debt. You have 1 month to find the money or you'll be evicted." After the tax collector left, Eleanor sat alone in her cottage and truly despaired for the first time. She was 35 years old but felt ancient. Her hair had begun to turn gray from stress and poor nutrition. Her hands were permanently stained from digging in the earth for roots to eat. She had grown so thin that her clothes hung on her like sacks. For 3 days, Eleanor sat in her cottage and tried to think of solutions. She could beg from her neighbors, but they had already given what they could. She could try to work in the village, but there were no jobs for a woman with no special skills. On the 4th day, Eleanor remembered Thomas's words more clearly than she had in years. "If you ever find yourself in desperate need, if you're starving or in danger, take this ring to London." Could he really have meant it? 7 years was a long time. If Thomas had been in some kind of trouble back then, he might be dead by now. Even if he was alive, he might have forgotten all about the peasant woman who had sheltered him during a storm. But what choice did she have? Eleanor pulled out the ring and examined it in the firelight. It was just as beautiful as she remembered. The gold still gleamed, and the red stone still seemed to hold fire inside it. The intricate engravings were as sharp as ever. Whatever else Thomas had lied about, this ring was definitely real and valuable. The next morning, Eleanor made her decision. She packed her few remaining possessions into a small cloth bundle: her mother's wooden comb, her wedding ring from William, and the precious ring from Thomas. She wrapped the gold ring carefully and sewed it into the hem of her dress where it would be safe from thieves. She locked her cottage door and hid the key under a loose stone, hoping against hope that she would return someday. Then she began the long walk to London. Eleanor had never traveled more than 10 miles from her village in her entire life. The journey to London was over 60 miles, and she had to walk every step. She had no money for food or lodging, so she slept under hedges and ate wild berries when she could find them. The first day, her feet were blistered and bleeding before she had walked 5 miles. By the second day, she was limping badly. By the third day, she was so weak from hunger that she had to rest every few hundred yards. But Eleanor kept walking. She had walked away from the only life she had ever known, and there was no going back. On the fourth day, she met a kind farmer who gave her a ride in his wagon for several miles. He also shared his bread with her, which probably saved her life. On the sixth day, a group of traveling merchants let her walk with them for protection and shared their evening meal around their campfire. Most people, though, ignored the thin woman in ragged clothes who walked slowly along the road. Some crossed to the other side to avoid her, thinking she might be diseased or dangerous. After 8 days of walking, Eleanor finally saw London in the distance. She had never imagined a city could be so large. Buildings stretched as far as she could see, and smoke from thousands of fires created a gray haze over everything. The noise was overwhelming. People shouting, horses clopping, wheels rattling over stones. Eleanor felt completely overwhelmed. How would she ever find Westminster Palace in this vast city? How would she even survive long enough to look for it? She asked directions from several people, but most ignored her or gave her suspicious looks. Finally, a kind baker's wife took pity on her and pointed her toward the great palace. Westminster Palace was like nothing Eleanor had ever seen. The building was enormous, with towers reaching up toward the sky and walls that seemed to go on forever. Gardens full of flowers she couldn't name surrounded the palace, and guards in bright uniforms stood at every entrance. Eleanor's courage almost failed her completely. How could she, a starving peasant woman, possibly walk up to this magnificent place and expect anyone to listen to her? But she had come too far to turn back now. Eleanor approached the main gate on trembling legs. 2 guards in red uniforms stood there, looking impressive and frightening. "What do you want?" one of the guards asked roughly when he saw her approaching. Eleanor's mouth was so dry she could barely speak. "Please, sir, I need to show you something." "Get away from here," the second guard said. "This is no place for beggars." "I'm not a beggar," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "I have something important to show you. A ring. A man named Thomas told me to bring it here." The guards looked at each other and laughed. "Thomas? Do you know how many men are named Thomas in England?" With shaking hands, Eleanor pulled out the ring and unwrapped it. "He said to show you this. He said you would know what to do." The moment the guards saw the ring, their expressions changed completely. The first guard's eyes went wide, and the second guard actually stepped backward. "Where did you get this?" the first guard demanded, his voice sharp with alarm. "A man gave it to me," Eleanor said. 7 years ago. He stayed in my cottage during a storm. He told me his name was Thomas, and he said if I ever needed help." The guards were no longer listening to her words. They were staring at the ring as if they had seen a ghost. "Captain," one of them shouted. "Captain Henley, come here immediately." A tall man in an even fancier uniform came running over. When he saw the ring in Eleanor's hands, his face went pale. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," Captain Henley whispered. "Where did you get King Edward's personal seal?" Eleanor's world tilted sideways. "King Edward? I don't understand. The man who gave this to me said his name was Thomas." Captain Henley looked at her with a mixture of amazement and suspicion. "Edward Thomas Tudor, that was his full name. King Edward VI of England. But that's impossible. King Edward died 4 years ago." Eleanor felt the ground sway beneath her feet. The mysterious stranger she had sheltered, the man who had struggled to chop wood and marveled at her simple herb garden, had been the King of England?